Hello and welcome to Right Now. Predictably, the variants are gathering pace and they're set to throw the roadmap to freedom crashing into an alligator-infested swamp. Really must get around to draining that. The variants are, of course, an invented fiction, but if they can fool enough plebs into believing their creation, then they believe they will get the support they need to halt the end of lockdowns. But just in case the peasants do revolt, and they appear to be, vaccination centres, test centres, they're getting vandalised on a daily basis in the UK now. So the government and its psychologists and the complicit media are now attempting to shift the blame onto the unvaccinated Brits for the fact that a variant apparently mutated in India and then arrived on a plane in the UK. Makes sense if you're an idiot. Also, why was the China virus racist but an Indian variant isn't? Can we have some consistency? No? No? Okay. On tonight's show, we have an NHS nurse. She's blowing the whistle on what has been going on over the last 14 months. They've asked to remain anonymous, and of course, we've respected that. Ice Age farmer Christian Westbrook is talking to us from the USA. Christian has been raising awareness of genuine climate change. No, not the Greta climate changes. How dare you? And what that means for the food supply, plus COVID lockdowns and what they've meant for harvesting food the world over. On a previous episode, Christiana spoke to lawyer Dr. Sue Gray in New Zealand. Sue was taking the New Zealand government to court over the mass rollout of the Pfizer vaccine. It was rolled out under emergency approval without safety data that's needed for people to make an informed decision. She's coming on to give us an update on the case. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is a journalist, author and former editor of Politics First, or if you read Wikipedia, he's a pro-Assad propagandist, good old Wikipedia. I'll be asking Marcus about Russia's role on the world stage and the constant demonisation of the country that it's been subjected over the last few years. We'll also be hearing from former NHS employee turned activist Louise Hampton about the protest movement in the UK. It's growing. First up, Nurse X, as we're going to call her, works within a hospital in the UK. She contacted us this week to reveal her experiences from the start of the pandemic all the way through to the present day. Thank you very much for coming on. Could you start off by explaining your role and what your job's been throughout the last 14 months?
Yes, the hospital I work in, I've been working there for 10 years now, and my role is a ward hostess, which basically means that I'm looking after patients' food and drinks orders. Some patients are on special meals, and because I'm bank, I can be on any ward in virtually the entire hospital, so I like that. That's my position, so I just work around where I'm needed. So yes, 10 years I've been there. The last 16 months, when the COVID first came out, it was just one of those things where we all took it seriously. We believed what we were being told, that it was a highly contagious disease. And, I was pretty worried at the beginning because they said how transferable it was, had to be careful. And very quickly the wards became COVID wards, or what was called COVID wards, so extra precautions had to be taken, and it seemed to spread quite quickly that the wards quickly sort of closed off to outsiders. So then we did have to wear PPE. It isn't quite what it has been as of late, but it was just the blue surgical face masks, aprons that we would normally wear with no sleeves, gloves, and yeah, so I was working on all the wards, and then, I'd go into work actually thinking, oh my gosh, yes, I do feel like I'm putting my health on the line going into these wards. I'd get home and wash all my clothes, have a shower, scrub, leave my shoes outside, because I just honestly believed it was possibly as contagious as the media was portraying it to be. It just took a little while to sort of realise things weren't as quite what they seemed, because I just thought, yes, we're full. So it was March, April that everyone was saying, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 deaths a day, it's completely full, it's overrun. And then I started to think to myself, I've been here 10 years, every single year the hospital is full all year round, no let up really. And of course I could be working on all the different wards, and I knew, for example, A&E, we used to have patients every winter, trolleys piling outside in the corridors of the A&E departments, just waiting to be seen. And it was just different. It just wasn't piles of people queuing up like it was. So yes, the wards did seem full. So potentially people could be thinking, oh my gosh, yes, we're overrun, it's full. And our workload was different because we had to take all these extra precautions. But I just started to think, I've seen hospitals fuller than this before. We also have an operations department at hospital, which I'm sure all hospitals do. And we have 4 senior ladies that used to be buzzing around the hospital, trying to get patients into care homes, home, discharge, whatever, because they were always trying to unblock beds because A&E was so overrun. So I always used to bump into these ladies, say hello to them on the wards or in the corridors. Their job was just busy trying to get rid of patients, basically, you know, get them home or whatever. And that all stopped. You just don't see them at all anymore. And now, as the wards aren't so full, there's always beds everywhere. And, you know, it just seemed very, very odd, like, why are they not sort of rushing around like they used to rush around? And, you know, it got towards the sort of summertime, and most of the wards had loads of empty beds by this stage, and the surgery centres were shut. They weren't doing any surgery, and in my role of sort of organising the food, I'd visit the kitchens a lot, and I'd speak to the head chef, and I'd just say, you know, what's the percentage of meals would you say you're with less? And you're all these patients not getting their cancer treatments or their surgeries, hip operations, whatever, and you've got all these empty beds here. And what I would say is a lot of the lower end staff, when I say lower end, that's a bit disrespectful, but sort of for my role, we're not highly trained, but the porters, the kitchen staff, cleaners, and ward hostesses, a lot of them sort of seemed to sort of realise something was amiss, but it was mainly the nurses and doctors, you know, really taking it very seriously and full on. And I did say to one of the doctors at some point that I just don't understand, because we don't seem to be having any flu deaths anymore. He said, oh, that's because everyone's mask wearing. And I'm thinking, well, these little blue masks that say on the outside do not protect against coronavirus. So they're very clever, but somehow they seem to be stopping flu, but not COVID-19.
What was your experience on the COVID wards? Because you were on the COVID wards as well, weren't you?
Yes, I was on all of them. There were the various different ones. I mean, eventually it became that you had to put more PPE on, and so we had these head coverings, visors or glasses, and the full gown things with the gloves as well. But something that struck me, because I got designated in the end to work on the COVID pneumonia ward. Normally it was called respiratory, but they were deciding it was going to be like an ICU, an offshoot from ICU. ICU normally has about 7 beds, which doesn't have my role there. And so I was working there from January 21 for 3 months till March, till it's all died down again. And majority of those times we were not full at all. There was a slight problem at the beginning because there was a lack of oxygen supply, so they had to keep them down. But then even in February, we still had less than full amount of patients. And at one point, we had 9 patients out of 21, and normally on respiratory, historically in the winter, because I used to work there quite a lot, it was always just chocker full, 1 out, next bed comes in, you know, within the next hour. So it just seemed very, very odd to have 12 empty beds. And these patients that we were told, you know, the most highly infectious disease, they're just, I mean, a lot of them were on oxygen, so that was fair enough, but they were all eating and drinking. Poor diets. They majority of them had type 2 diabetes, majority were overweight. But I also said to one of the nurses, gosh, these are typically standard type of patients we get year on year, you know. And I said, just seems strange that we don't have flu now, but we have COVID. But they just seem to, you know, worryingly go along with it instead of asking questions. So yes, these patients, you go around with the food and they want the full fat foods, the biscuits, you offer them the fresh fruit. No thanks, love, I'll have 4 sugars in my tea.
Right.
It's, you know, you just sort of think, gosh, these are the patients. And it almost felt like these patients thought, oh, well, I've got COVID, I get extra special treatments. They were really hard work, if I say that.
Right.
And something else that sort of shocked me, which was definitely out of sorts, was January this year, the military came into the hospital. So I asked, what's going on here? Oh, they've come to help out. So I checked with the porters because they were doing some of the porters' work. And the porter said to me, oh, they've come for photo shoot opportunities. Obviously, the porter was aware it wasn't all what it seemed.
No.
And they were there for about at least 8 weeks, I'd say, and they were doing jobs because patients' families weren't allowed to go and visit anymore, so they're bringing clothes and food packages that were being left at reception. And the porters said, we're actually not getting shifts now because there's no work for us, the bank shift. So bank people rely on having work, say if people go sick or there's annual leave, etc. So they weren't getting work, and there were different about every couple of weeks they change over to different ones. So they were staying in a hotel, being put up locally. So they were just milling around the hospital, and of course to the outsider it just looks like, oh my gosh, the military's here, things must be bad if they've had to
Of course.
get the military involved. So just so many things didn't add up. And something that I found really worrying, occasionally work on A&E, and of course it would always be having certain periods of time when it'd be really, really quiet. But historically, it was just always get really, really busy. But of course, with the narrative of the government, it's like, please, stay away, protect the NHS, save lives. And we just weren't seeing any patients. So going through A&E, it was like the Mary Celeste. It was spot the patients, groups of doctors and nurses sitting on their chairs. They weren't doing TikToks, but they were on their phones. There was just nothing to do. So, of course, as soon as a patient came in, I'd go straight over, find out if they needed to eat or drink. It was just like, yay, there's something to do.
Something to do, yeah.
Yeah. And then after that, works in the A&E department, and she just got really, really concerned after, it was quite quiet, and suddenly it got really, really busy. And she's just telling me that there's so many vaccine victims coming in, and all ages, but majority of them young, under 30s, with serious things as well. And she'd get quite upset. It's just awful because the doctors are actually really shocked. They don't know what to do because there's so many are coming in, and they're like, oh my gosh, you could hear them saying, oh my God, there's another vaccine victim coming in. And they were with conditions such as strokes, heart problems, palsies, blood clots, all sorts of things really. I mean, it's just lots of different ones. And she'd just say more than 50% of the patients coming in were now down to vaccine victims.
That's unbelievable. Well, it's not unbelievable, but in terms of the mainstream narrative, you're not hearing any of that.
No.
You're not hearing any of it.
And there was something in the media, I think it was in the Sun and the Evening Standard, to say that they were seeing an unprecedented amount of patients coming to A&E with minor headaches. And you think to yourself, when would you ever think, oh, I'll go to A&E, I've got a minor headache? I mean, yes, she was saying that some of the patients did have severe headaches, but you don't go to A&E worrying about queuing up for hours for a minor headache. You take some paracetamol. So it was interesting. I mean, something that has changed since then is now when patients are being brought in, once they come through the waiting room and seen at triage, they're asked, have you had the vaccine? Because they're now linking it obviously straight away.
It's unbelievable that well, first of all, I want to say as well, thank you very much. And you say you can't make a difference. You are by speaking out, because people at home don't know this stuff that's actually going on in hospitals. But if you've got 50% of the people coming into A&E are with vaccine injuries, and they're wanting to start jabbing children from September, this is just going to go on and on and on. And it's, for me anyway, I just look at it and it's like trying to keep a rabbit in a hat. It's just not going to happen. In the end, the whole thing's going to pop out. And I was going to ask you kind of whether in your experience, these nurses and doctors that maybe you were talking to at during the first wave or whatever, that were very much, this is really bad, have changed their kind of view in any way? You know, they're looking now at these vaccine injuries and thinking, hang on.
Well, I mean, I know the doctors and nurses in A&E were sort of quite taken aback because there had been no warning about it. So I don't work there regularly, but the feedback I got through sources was saying that they obviously were really concerned about it and they had a reporting system for it, but whether it went any further within the NHS or whether it was just sort of put to one side, I don't know. But I just sort of feel sad, you know, our caring environment of doing the jobs we're doing now, it just seems like the patient care has gone really downhill. And for me, you know, we all have to wear the masks now, and the majority of the patients are elderly and they can't see our faces, they can't hear us, and it's a miserable time for them. They can't have family, friends visits. The whole patient care system just has completely changed. And for me, my role was chatting to the patients, and you know, people would always be happy when they hear the trolley come along and they get a cup of tea and a packet of biscuits and a chit chat. And I still try and do that, but it's virtually impossible with a mask on because a
It's
lot
not
of
the
them
same.
can't see. They need to see your expressions, your smiles, and it's just very sad, you know, how things are.
Yeah, absolutely. But thank you very much for speaking out. We really do appreciate it. And I'm just hoping now, you know, that as more people's within the hospital, more people's experience that they see with their own eyes, you know, like, so the people you're talking about that've worked in the A&E and are seeing it with their own eyes, it differs so far from what the media is saying. I just hope that those people are going to start to speak out eventually as well, because it
Well,
needs
I
to
hope
happen.
so too, because, you know, patients' lives are going to be suffering more and more, and you know, it is hard for people to speak out, but if more and more people did it, it'd be so much easier for everybody. And
Yeah, exactly. But thank you again for talking to us, and thank you for having the courage to speak out as well. And if only more people had that courage.
oh, well, thank you very much. It's something that needs doing, and I feel like you know, it's my duty to speak out.
Absolutely. Thank you. Christian Westbrook, aka the Ice Age Farmer, has been making some fantastic content for some time now, really laying out what's actually happening in terms of the Earth's climate, but also what that means for our ability to feed ourselves and how those that would wish to control the population are exploiting those changes. Christian, thank you for talking to us. But what is happening with the Earth's climate and what does that mean for food supply?
Yeah, that's a big question. So the best way to look at that is to look back in history and notice that when we look at the behavior of the sun, you know, just very briefly, it has what everyone calls a Schwab cycle. It's a normal 11-year sort of heartbeat of the sun, where it goes into a high activity, a lot of sunspots, gives us nice solar wind and protection from stuff coming from space. But then it also goes into the lower period, bottoms out, no sunspots for a bit. And that changes the growing conditions here on planet, as well as more volcanic and seismic activity, more hail, a wavier jet stream, which we experience as cold air from the Arctic slipping down, and they say, oh, it's the polar vortex, or warm air from the other flows going up to the poles. Then the media screams and says, oh, it's global warming. But what's actually happening here is that in addition to that 11-year heartbeat of the sun, the Schwab cycle, there are as well longer extended periods, like a grand maximum, like the one we've been enjoying. If you go check out the sunspot cycles on Wikipedia or anywhere really, you'll see that the last 80 years we've had these heightened solar cycles, and that affords us nice, very stable growing conditions, a very stable jet stream. And so that has been the case during the last 80 years or so, during which we've stood up all of modern agriculture. So everything we know, all these at-scale monocropping, and you know, I have complaints, I'm sure we all have complaints about corporate agriculture, but stepping aside from those, the whole thing depends on those stable growing conditions. What's interesting now is that as has happened throughout history in the past, the sun is going into a grand solar minimum, and those 11-year sunspot cycles become diminished or actually just disappear for a time altogether, as happened during the modern minimum. And that's why I said we can learn the most, instead of just sort of speculating, oh my gosh, the sun's going to sleep, what's going to happen? We can just say, okay, we've survived this before. What did it look like before in the Dalton minimum 200 years ago, in the Maunder minimum before that? And when you look back at the history, you see that, yes, we did have terrible growing seasons. You can look at the journals of Thomas Jefferson and see that 80% of the corn crop failed during these the year without a summer, where there were frosts throughout even throughout all the months of the year, even the summer. there were frosts, which obviously is very bad for agricultural production. And then during the Maunder minimum, this corresponded with a period called the Little Ice Age, or the Mini Ice Age in Europe, where crop production was greatly diminished. People plowed through their stocks of food and then of seeds, which meant that there was nothing to plant next year. And so time and time, these grand solar minima are happening while there's tremendous impact to agriculture, and because of that, a great loss of life in famine. So it's worth noting that this has happened in the past and that this is what we're going into now. And if we had any sensible leadership, then we would learn from that and we would say, okay, we need to stand up new ways of growing food that are going to be more stable, look back at indigenous practices and regenerative practices in permaculture, these things that are naturally more resilient to shifts in climate. But instead, we're just watching crops fail, and then of course the technocracy is saying, well, we need to fail forward into more fake foods, into synthetic lab-grown meat, into bug protein, and that's the food system that they want to stand up, using this crisis as an opportunity to do that, rather than address the problem and work in humanity's best interest. So that's sort of where we are in a nutshell.
Would the Earth getting cooler, would that affects the carbon dioxide, as it would bring that down? Which then would affect, growing, obviously. So then I'm looking at that and thinking that they're trying to take more carbon dioxide out the air as well. That it almost feels like a perfect storm then.
A perfect storm is a good way to describe what's going on right now, because, like I said, it's not just that we have these natural cycles that are affecting our production. It's that governments are acting not even in their own interest. They're just seizing this opportunity to take control of our food production. And so right now, as our grain stocks for the last years now the way they say it is we're below pipeline levels, which means we're eating more than we're growing. And that's been the case for several years. And so we're now approaching this day of reckoning where, we're now seeing it, where food prices are hopping to decadal highs, corn, soybeans, now wheat is following not far behind. And so countries are trying to reformulate animal feed, and they're starting to shut down exports. And this is where it gets really hairy, because when we see, as has now happened, Argentina shutting off soy, corn, and even now beef exports, that's Brazil is trying to buy from Argentina. They can't, because of those shutdowns, they can't get the animal feed they need for the animals. And so just yesterday, in fact, the largest poultry producer in the world said, we're going to have to start just killing our animals because we can't afford to feed them given $7 corn. And so we see this dismantling of the meat industry happening. That's why Bill Gates is out there saying everyone needs to be eating fake food, lab-grown meat. That's the way of the future, is that they're, through a combination of the natural cycles and the regulatory structures and the economic squeeze that's been placed on farming and ranching for some time, plus just the demonization of it, saying that it's because of dirty farming and ranching and these antiquated practices that we have these problems, right? We still know COVID-19 is being blamed on a meat market, right? So you can see this is actually one big picture, all part of this depopulation agenda that's steaming forward here.
That's what I was going to ask, actually, in terms of COVID, because that will have, the excuse of COVID will have been used to break down, obviously, exports and imports, but also if people are shut down, like they're saying in India, where they're in lockdown and they can't harvest because they're locked up. So COVID just seems, again, like I said, perfect storm earlier. It just seems that there's another massive cloud just chucks into this perfect storm. It just seems completely coordinated to me.
Without a doubt. And I would even say that this last year has been the warm-up for the real crisis, which is these food shortages. And this is also something that they've war-gamed out before. There was an event in 2015 called the Food Chain Reaction Game, which was sponsored by George Soros. It was run by John Podesta at the Center for American Progress. And it said, okay, that we're going to have a pandemic and climate change, and it's going to mean that crops are affected, and then there's going to be a global crisis. And what we expect to happen is that these pesky nationalists will start acting in their own interests. And really what we need is more global government. And they actually even went so far as to say, as part of their tabletop exercise, that to avert further food crises, we need a global carbon tax. So all of this plays right into their net zero carbon agenda, long-term plans. And I think people aren't, when you look at those plans, it's like no private ownership of cars, no air travel. We're going to shut down all economic activity and human travel on the planet. It's really pretty stark, the futures that they've got constructed for us. And so they need this crisis. They need everyone to feel food shortages and the pain there at the grocery stores when they see empty shelves, so that they will accept this next leg of the agenda. Because as you know, the sentiment around like COVID-19 and all these restrictions already turned quite sour. People are pretty tired of what's going on right now. And a lot of people are seeing through lives, thanks to, in no small part, to work like yours. And so, yeah, they need a fresh scare. They need a new boogeyman, and that's the food shortages that they have engineered for exactly this purpose.
It ties in then with the World Economic Forum's "You will own nothing, but you'll be happy." That whole thing is amazing to watch, all these little chess pieces just being moved around. I also heard, I've actually seen on one of your podcasts as well, but I heard from first-hand experience, someone said to me the other day that they work in the building industry, and that there is just a massive slowdown of supply of wood and stuff like that. And so what I was going to ask you was, what would you advise for people to do in terms of growing their own food? But then obviously the infrastructure that you would need to purchase, like wood and things to build these, they're slowing down as well. It almost feels like the squeeze is on everything.
You said it very well there. And so, yeah, for years, anticipating that we would have problems with growing crops and we needed to address the food situation, my message has been, like you said, start growing food, start raising animals, grow that garden, start saving seeds from your garden so that we all stand ready to share those seeds with our neighbors as they figure out, whoa, I need to be growing my own food too. I can't afford the food at the grocery store, if it's even there. And so, yeah, now that we broaden the scope of that conversation to say, oh, I can't get lumber anymore. There's lumber shortages. I can't get plastics because all the plastic resin plants were shut down in Texas when the grid went down, and some of them have still to this day not even been restarted. Commodities crunches all over. And beyond that, there's just the supply chain breaking down. You've got lines of ships waiting to dock on multiple ports to unload their container goods. There's shortages of containers. So yeah, again, perfect storm is a pretty good way to describe what is looking like a systematic and cascading failures applying to the supply chain. And yeah, so the message is then to broaden that conversation from just growing food to do everything, grow everything. When we can't be consumers anymore, the only model that works for us now is to become producers. So if we're growing our own food, if we're raising our own animals, if we are harvesting our own lumber, if we are producing our own medicines from herbs or whatever skills you have, and it really will take all of us thinking about this in that creative way, like, okay, if this system is breaking down, and it is, how do we do this? How do we make our own families and our communities around us more resistant to that? And the key there is really those of us that are having this conversation right now that see this happening and don't just throw our heads in the dirt. Or I know, people are busy with jobs and things, I understand. But for those of us that are aware of this and are having this conversation now, we really need to be focusing our efforts on standing up, not just systems that produce for us, but systems that will produce in ways that allow other people to become producers in the coming weeks and months as they realize that these supply chains it's not delivering anymore. So that's the way forward.
I think this is happening across the board. I mean, I'm seeing lots of conversations online, but also conversations I've had with people in private where not even to do with the food supply, but to do with COVID and the vaccine passports and all this sort of stuff, that people are saying we're going to have to create our own culture, our own, country, basically within your own country, where, you buy up some land and you go off grid and away from, what's happening. And that sounds like it would be a scary thing, but I'm actually thinking I'm embracing that now. I think that sounds great.
It's certainly a step up from, we can't just stay in the cities and then let this thing roll over us. So yeah, I think these islands of freedom, or there's a number of different words, freedom cells that people are standing up it's absolutely the way to get a community built up around that local economy, hyper local economy, producing what you need and teaching your kids rather than just throwing them into the system. And then networking with these other groups to make sure that we are able to meet each other's needs and keep each other running. But again, I just want to stress this one part, because I do think that's a good idea, but I want to augment it with, we can't just run to the hills and then hide out there and wait for this whole thing to bubble over, because they have, the whole agenda includes these satellites spying from the sky and the drone armies. So we have to also put a stop to what's going on right now. So yes, I think retreat to immediate safety where we can produce food and sort of take care of our families and communities in the near future here, but still with everything we have, we've got to be fighting this agenda.
Oh, I agree completely. And there's one positive that's come out of this whole thing, is that over the last 14 months, like you mentioned there, networking. I've met so many people and been introduced through different people, and that's one thing that I kind of, if the world, if all the world leaders went, oh, sorry, it was a joke, I was only playing, it was just messing around, you can have your old life back, it was just an elaborate gag. I don't want it. Like those parts of it, I don't want them. I don't want to go back to that normality. I kind of quite like the new people that I've met, and people like yourself, and learning from what you're saying and stuff. It's more interesting.
And that's, let's point that out and amplify it a little bit. That is the silver lining to these black clouds, is that it is ridiculously dark, the agenda they have, the things they're doing, the shots that they're, everything that's going on is pretty, it can be discouraging. But it has to be that bad in order to wake up enough people for us to get out of it. So I think the situation is exactly as bad as it must get before humanity remembers who we are and gets down to the business of cleaning this route out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on. Thanks for talking to us, Christian. I really appreciate it. And I would urge anyone that's not obviously watched any of your videos, The Ice Age Farmer, I'm sure most of you have, I would urge you to watch them, because I like the way you spell stuff out as well. You talk normally. You don't talk jargon, which is something that you tend to find, and it's like, that's a bit over my head. I don't understand the terminology, whereas you put things in simple terms, and that's great for people to listen to.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for being here. And there is a lot of jargon. It's part of the way that they get away with having an open conspiracy like this, where they're just like, yeah, we're going to use stakeholder capitalism and human capital finance to commoditize you and your children's future, and we're going to incentivize good, healthy choice. And all that means, we're taking total control of your children. We're taking total control of your food supply. Underneath that flowery, philanthropic sounding language is just a perfect surveillance and control grid. So yes, they use that code, they use those words and that jargon for that reason, I think, to keep people not understanding wholly what's going on, and then keep us from fighting back. And that's also why it's being rolled forward so quickly. But thanks again for having me.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
To continue watching this episode of Right Now, please click on to iconic.com.